Americans tend to revere our most preeminent honorary citizen, Winston Churchill. That's because they think of him in the context that most of us, not, of course, President Obama, who shortly after taking office somewhat gratuitously shipped a bust of Winnie back to the British Embassy. But for most of us, we think of him as this extraordinary, indefatigable, courageous, inspiring wartime leader who got his country through the dark days leading up to and the beginning of World War II and ultimately saw it through to victory. We, most of us at least, fail to remember that for much of the 2 decades prior to that, Winston Churchill was reviled by most of his countrymen. Partly this was because he was telling them things they didn't want to hear. He was talking about what he called the gathering storm to a people who were so exhausted by the horrors of what was then called the war to end all wars that they wanted no part of another conflict, another meat grinder that would liquidate a generation of Britons as had World War I. And yet, Winston Churchill saw it as his duty to challenge these Pollyannish intelligence assessments that were causing his government to underinvest, as they wished to, needless to say, but use these intelligence assessments to justify the woeful underfunding of Britain's rearmament program at a time when Hitler was rebuilding his country's military at an incredible clip. Winston Churchill was also challenging the government itself and the policies that it was following, notably the policies of appeasement towards Hitler, warning that what would come of it was nothing but grief. After these warnings proved right, most especially in the tragedy of the failed appeasement over Czechoslovakia that the then Prime Minister of Britain, Neville Chamberlain, engaged in, Winston Churchill was brought back into government, ultimately to become the Prime Minister rather, of his country at the darkest moment. I'm reminded of this because I believe we have our own Churchill at the moment. A man who has also, like Winston Churchill, distinguished himself in public service over many, many years. A man who has been reviled, particularly in recent years, for some of that public service. Whose warnings about a new gathering storm are unwelcome. Whose challenges to flawed intelligence assessments, whose very harsh criticism of actions that are diminishing our military capability and preparedness, and not least demeaning those who serve, especially in our intelligence services. I'm talking, of course, of Dick Cheney, the former Vice President of the United States, who, at a dinner that we did for him here at the Center for Security Policy last week, spoke once again in the kinds of words that were, I think, Churchillian. He talked passionately about the mistake of abandoning our Czech and Polish friends again. This time in connection with the missile defense deployment that had been promised them by the previous administration. He warned about appeasing Vladimir Putin of Russia. He said no good can come of it. He, of course, reminded us of the folly of standing against, or at least being indifferent to, those who were trying to secure their freedom in Iran, and instead pursuing willy-nilly this notion of engagement with the mullahs there. And perhaps The most prominent piece of the speech, because it received a great deal of public attention, was his criticism of the dithering that President Obama appears to be doing over Afghanistan and leaving our troops and their commanders twisting in the wind at a moment when perhaps the very future of our efforts to prevent the return of the Taliban and renewal of a al-Qaeda safe haven in Afghanistan hangs in the balance. But he was arguably most Churchillian in his comments about our intelligence personnel and the efforts they've made to keep us safe, in particular those who engaged in enhanced interrogation of detainees, prisoners. We've captured combatants, unlawful enemy combatants that we've captured on the battlefields around the world. And he spoke, I think, with great passion about them. And I'd like to just quote from Dick Cheney in this particular regard. He said, quote, "To call enhanced interrogation a program of torture is not only to disregard the program's legal underpinnings and safeguards. Such accusations are a libel against dedicated professionals who acted honorably and well in our country's name and in our country's cause." He went on to say, "For all that we've lost in this conflict, the United States has never lost its moral bearings, and least of all can that be said of our armed forces and intelligence personnel. They have done right. They have made our country safer, and a lot of Americans are alive today because of them." Winston Churchill considered it a terrible personal failure that he was unable to prevent the carnage of World War II, despite all of his warnings and all of his efforts to teach his countrymen and use his parliamentary privileges to warn them of what was afoot. In truth, then as now, the responsibility ultimately rests not with the watchman who raises the alarm, but with those who fail to heed his warnings. We cannot afford to make the same mistake today by ignoring the formidable insights and sound prescriptions articulated by our Churchill. Thanks for listening.